The wind over Le Havre carried a bitterness that winter, a wind that knew too much of death. It blew through the ruins of Europe, past the collapsed roofs of farmhouses and the husks of burned tanks, down to the coast where the sea met the shattered roads. There, under a gray French sky, a column of women stumbled forward. German prisoners of war, stripped of pride, shivering in thin wool uniforms that no longer bore insignia. The year was 1945, the war almost spent, but in their minds, it was not yet over. They were told they would be transported to a Vernehmungslager, an interrogation camp. That word carried ghosts. In their imagination, it meant bright lamps, shouting men, and questions sharpened like knives. Some of these women had been clerks, nurses, auxiliaries. Others had simply followed the collapsing front lines, caught in surrender. Yet they carried the same dread as soldiers, that the victors would demand a debt of suffering equal to what Germany had inflicted. The truck stopped near the docks, where salt and diesel mixed with the smell of damp wood. The women were ordered out, boots sinking into mud. A warehouse loomed before them, its walls streaked with soot, windows shattered. One of the women whispered, "Das ist es." This is it. Another crossed herself. They waited for the shouting to begin, but the guards were silent. The Americans, their uniforms clean but eyes hollow from years of war, simply motioned them inside. The women obeyed, hearts pounding. The floor was bare concrete. The air hung cold enough to see breath. They stood shoulder to shoulder, 30, maybe 40 of them, waiting for the punishment they had been told would come. Then the door closed behind them. At first, only the sound of boots approached. Slow, deliberate. A man's voice said something in English, too softly to understand. When the women didn't move, a translator stepped forward, his accent heavy but kind. "You will be examined for frostbite," he said. "You will be given blankets." Blankets. The word drifted through the air like something from another world. They did not move. Some thought it a trick, that the warmth would come first. Then the interrogation. Yet when the door opened again, American medics entered carrying armfuls of wool, khaki, and olive drab, smelling faintly of soap and storage. One by one, they began to drape them over the women's shoulders. No questions. No anger. Only the soft rustle of fabric and the clumsy tenderness of men unused to gentleness. A young woman named Liesel felt one settle over her back, heavy, rough, but warm. She looked up, expecting to meet the cold stare of a guard. Instead, she saw a medic, perhaps 25, his hands trembling slightly as he tucked the edges around her arms. His eyes did not carry hatred, only exhaustion and something else, maybe pity. Her knees gave way. She sank to the floor, clutching the blanket as though it were her last shield. Across the room, another woman began to sob, the sound low at first, then breaking open like ice. It spread, rippling through the line. The warehouse filled with a sound no one had expected. Not screams, but tears. Tears of confusion, of disbelief, of something beginning to thaw that had been frozen for too long. Outside, the wind howled across the harbor, but inside, steam began to rise from tin kettles. The medics had lit small stoves, heating water for tea, disinfectant, and washing. The smell of warmth, a mix of metal and wet wool, filled the air. It was almost unbearable. One of the older women whispered, "Why are they doing this?" No one answered. None could. For years they had been told that Americans were monsters, that capture meant violation, humiliation, the end of all dignity. Propaganda posters had painted Allied soldiers as beasts, bayoneting children and burning villages. And yet here, in this desolate French port, the same soldiers covered them with blankets and brewed hot water. The shock cut deeper than any interrogation could have. When the first kettle whistled, an American medic poured hot water into a basin and gestured toward the women's hands. "Frostbite," he said, and pointed gently. One by one, they came forward. The heat bit at their skin, but it felt like the world returning to life. Liesel stared at her reflection in the surface of the water. Hollow eyes, lips cracked, hair matted with sea salt. She barely recognized herself. She wondered how the man before her, her enemy, could see anything human there. Yet he offered her a tin cup and said, "Drink, slowly." She obeyed, and for the first time since the fall of Berlin, she felt something move inside her chest. Something soft, painful, alive. In the corner, the translator watched silently. He had seen this before. Prisoners discovering mercy, their minds unable to hold it. He knew that this was the real work of peace, not treaties or surrenders, but moments like this, when compassion disarmed hatred without a word. The medics did not speak much that night. They moved quietly, distributing more blankets, checking frostbitten feet, cleaning small wounds. A radio in the corner played faintly, a slow American ballad about going home. Some of the women closed their eyes, pretending for a moment that they understood the words. Outside, snow began to fall over the ruined port. Soft, unannounced. It covered the wreckage, the burned vehicles, the forgotten rifles. The sea swallowed the sound of distant engines. In that silence, something ancient shifted. Not victory, not defeat, but the beginning of forgiveness neither side had asked for. As dawn crept through the broken windows, light touched the faces of sleeping women wrapped in army blankets. The medics watched over them, leaning against the wall, cups of coffee steaming in their hands. None spoke. They all knew that this night, this small act, would never appear in any history book. Yet, in some quiet way, it had already changed the world. Outside, the wind softened. The sea breathed slow, and the war, for a moment, seemed very far away. When the morning light reached the Le Havre transit camp, it came pale and cautious, as if unsure it was welcome. The broken panes of the warehouse turned it into thin ribbons of gold that trembled across the concrete floor. The women woke slowly beneath the heavy wool blankets, their breath hanging in the air like smoke. For a few seconds, they forgot where they were. Then the sound of boots outside reminded them. They were prisoners. Yet the silence that followed was strange. No shouted orders, no dogs, no rattling chains. Only the creak of the door and the low murmur of English voices beyond it. The women sat upright, tightening the blankets around their shoulders. Some still expected punishment to come later, after this strange pause of calm. Others, the younger ones, seemed unable to speak at all, afraid that any sound would end the fragile mercy of the night before. Outside, the Americans were setting up a makeshift field kitchen. The smell of coffee and oatmeal drifted in, awakening hunger that had long been forgotten. One of the medics, a sergeant from Ohio named Lewis, leaned against the doorway, cup in hand, watching the women through the morning light. He had fought through Normandy, had seen men burned in tanks, and yet the sight before him, shivering women clutching blankets as if they were life itself, filled him with something he could not name. He said quietly to the interpreter, "Tell them breakfast's coming." The words, translated into German, sounded almost unreal. "Frühstück kommt." For a moment, no one moved. Then one woman, frail, her cheeks hollow, began to cry again, but softly this time. Her tears were not from fear, but from the unbearable confusion of kindness. Liesel, still wrapped in her blanket, watched the Americans ladle food into metal trays. The steam curled upward, ghostly, almost sacred. When her turn came, she stepped forward with her head bowed. The medic behind the counter smiled faintly and said, "You'll need this," handing her a spoon. His English tone was gentle, almost fatherly. She sat with the others on the cold floor, balancing the tray in her lap. The first taste of warm porridge startled her tongue. Too sweet. Too real. For months she had lived on bread crusts and boiled turnips. Now, even this simple meal felt like a feast. Across the room, the interpreter sat with Lewis and the other medics. They spoke in low voices. "They thought we'd beat them," the interpreter said. "One of them whispered last night that she expected worse." Lewis looked down at his hands. Rough from the cold, the same hands that had once loaded rifles. "I don't blame them," he said quietly. "After what we saw back east, the camps, the bodies, I didn't think I could ever look at a German again and not feel hate. But..." He gestured toward the women huddled in silence. "These aren't the ones who built that hell. They're just what's left." The interpreter nodded. "The war ends differently for everyone." The hours passed slowly. Some of the women began to speak in hushed German, trading fragments of their past lives. A bakery in Cologne, a child left behind in Dresden, a husband lost near the Oder. Each voice carried the same emptiness, the same quiet admission. Everything they had believed in had vanished. Liesel listened, her thoughts drifting like smoke. She remembered the speeches, the banners, the parades, the promise of a new Germany that was supposed to last 1,000 years. She remembered the schoolroom lectures about honor and sacrifice, about enemies and purity. But now, in this warehouse filled with the scent of coffee and diesel, she realized that those words had been written by men who never stood in the cold. She looked toward the Americans again. They were talking softly, laughing sometimes, as soldiers do to survive exhaustion. One was showing a photograph from home, a wife and 2 children in front of a car. The sight struck her like a stone. They were not monsters. They were men who missed home. The recognition was almost unbearable. Outside, the sky cleared. The snow that had fallen during the night began to melt, forming thin rivers along the street. The sea breeze carried the sound of ship horns, reminders that the world beyond this camp was moving again. In the afternoon, the medics returned with buckets of warm water. "For washing," said the interpreter. The women hesitated once more, fearing inspection or humiliation. But the medics simply set the buckets down, turned their backs, and left towels beside them. The gesture, that silent respect, broke the last of their defenses. One by one, the women washed their faces, the dirt and salt running down into the cracks of the concrete. The water was not clean for long, but the act itself was sacred. For the first time in months, they felt like human beings again. Liesel caught her reflection in the small mirror someone had placed on a crate. The woman staring back was thin, her eyes hollow. But behind them was a faint light, something that had survived everything. She whispered to herself, "Ich bin noch da." I am still here. At dusk, when the lamps flickered on, a few of the women gathered near the door, watching the Americans finish their work for the day. One guard, a young private with freckles, looked up and smiled awkwardly before stepping out into the cold. None of the women returned the smile, but many felt something shift quietly within them, the realization that fear was beginning to lose its grip. Inside, silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of dread, but of reflection. The wind outside rattled the tin roof, and the blankets rustled as the women lay down again, close together for warmth. Liesel lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. She could still feel the weight of the blanket on her shoulders, a weight that seemed heavier than its fabric, as if carrying the warmth of those who had given it. For the first time, she did not pray for escape or revenge. She simply whispered into the dark, "Danke," and outside, beyond the walls, the tide rose slowly against the harbor stones, washing away the tracks of their march, the footprints of fear fading beneath the water. Night fell again over the port of Le Havre, and the cold returned with its patient, merciless rhythm. The women slept under their American blankets, close enough to feel each other's breath. Outside, waves struck the harbor wall with the dull sound of warships long gone. Inside, there was only breathing, the rustle of wool, and the sound of one heart after another learning how to beat without fear. But not all could sleep. Liesel lay awake, eyes open to the dark beams above. Her mind returned to the face of the medic who had wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The gesture haunted her. Simple, wordless, but heavier than any weapon she had ever seen. She tried to remember what his hands had felt like. Rough, trembling, human. Once, she had been told that Americans were demons, that they killed without mercy, that they hated Germans with the same burning purity Germany had been taught to hate them. But that man's eyes had carried no hatred, only fatigue and something deeper. Compassion born of too much suffering. When morning came, the Americans brought bread. Real bread, not the coarse substitute they had grown used to. The crust cracked under the touch. It smelled faintly of yeast and smoke. As the women ate, one of them, a nurse named Erica, whispered, "Do you think they are mocking us?" Liesel shook her head slowly. "No, I think they are simply done with hate." Erica frowned. No one is ever done with hate. Outside, the American guards stood smoking, their silhouettes framed against the gray light. They were not much older than the women inside. The translator, a Frenchman named René, spoke with one of them, a private from Kansas. "They look like ghosts," the private said. René nodded. "So do you." The private smiled weakly. "Guess we all do." There was truth in that. Every face in that port, German, American, or French, carried the same hollow look of those who had seen too much. The war had erased differences faster than flags could divide them. Later that day, the women were lined up for medical inspection. Not the brutal kind they had feared, but one done with professionalism and quiet care. They were checked for frostbite, infection, lice, small, humiliating things that nonetheless spoke of survival. The medics avoided touching more than necessary. They used gauze, gloves, averted eyes. Liesel watched as Erica flinched when a medic lifted her hand to examine her wrist. "It's just to check circulation," René translated softly. Erica nodded, tears forming, though no pain had been given. For these women, even gentleness hurt. The medics worked quickly, moving from one to the next. Each act of care cut another thread of the fear that had bound the prisoners since capture. Yet each also forced them to face something far more terrifying: the death of what they had believed about themselves. That afternoon, Lewis, the sergeant from Ohio, walked among them again, checking bandages, asking brief questions. His German was broken, but sincere. "No hurt?" he asked. "Feet okay?" Liesel nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Danke." He smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "Welcome." When he moved on, she found herself trembling again. Not from cold this time, but from something that felt like shame. These men had every reason to despise her. Their cities had been bombed by her nation. Their friends had died in the mud her leaders had made. Yet they gave her warmth, food, care. What did it mean, then, to have been on the side that called itself the superior race? That night, Liesel wrote in her mind. She had no paper. A letter she knew she would never send. Mother, they did not torture us. They gave us blankets. They gave us bread. I don't understand. Everything we were told was a lie. The enemy has more kindness than we had for our own. I feel something breaking inside. Something that cannot be repaired. Beyond the camp walls, France was rebuilding in slow silence. Children scavenged for coal among ruins. Fishermen mended nets beside the same sea that had carried invasion fleets. The war's end had not brought peace, only exhaustion. In that exhaustion, kindness had become the only rebellion left. As the week passed, the women began to move more freely within the camp. They helped sweep the floor, carried water, and even learned fragments of English. Thank you, they practiced awkwardly. The medics responded with bitte schön, laughing softly. The barrier between them thinned. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Louis and Renee brought in a small radio. Music crackled through static, a slow jazz tune, something foreign and tender. The women froze, unsure if they were allowed to listen. Then one of the medics nodded, smiling. The sound filled the warehouse like warmth. For Liesel, it was the first music she had heard since before the bombing of Hamburg. She closed her eyes and let it move through her. The melody felt like forgiveness itself. Fragile, uncertain, but real. A few of the women began humming softly. Others stared at the floor, afraid to feel too much. One of the Americans said something about home, and Renee translated. He says this song reminds him of his wife. Liesel looked up. Does he think of her when he looks at us? She asked quietly. Renee hesitated. No. When he looks at you, he thinks of peace. That night, as the radio faded into silence, the women lay beneath their blankets, and the medics sat near the stove, dozing. The war still roared in memory. Gunfire, commands, the endless march. But within those four walls, another sound began to rise. So quiet, it could barely be heard. The sound of humanity returning. The women did not yet know it. But in that small French port, something had begun that would echo through their lives long after repatriation. A truth learned not in battle, but in the hands that covered them with wool instead of chains, and in the flickering light of the stove, they slept. Enemies no longer, only human beings beneath the same thin roof, waiting for a dawn that would finally belong to all of them. The dawn of the fourth day came with a silence so deep, it seemed the world itself had stopped to breathe. The sea mist hung low over Le Havre, veiling the broken cranes and rusting ships in a thin silver haze. Inside the warehouse, the air had grown warmer, not because of any change in the weather, but because the fear that once filled it was beginning to melt. Liesel awoke before the others. She sat up, clutching her blanket, and listened. Outside, she could hear the soft clatter of tin cups, the murmur of American voices, the faint sound of a harmonica carried on the wind. It was a sound she would never have believed could come from an enemy's camp. For the first time, she noticed how the light touched everything differently now. Softer, slower, as if it too had grown tired of war. Across the room, Erica stirred. Her hair, once carefully pinned in the manner expected of German women, now fell loose over her face. She looked years older. "You're awake again," she whispered. "I can't sleep," Liesel said. "When I close my eyes, I see everything we were told. And then I see them. Erica gave a hollow laugh. Them? You mean the guards? The ones bringing us coffee and blankets? Yes. Liesel's voice was quiet. I don't know what to believe anymore. Erica looked toward the door, where faint sunlight outlined the wooden frame. We believed in walls. Maybe it's time they fall. The words lingered between them like the smoke from the medic stoves. Later that morning, Renee, the French interpreter, gathered a small group of the women and led them outside for fresh air. The sky was cold blue, the kind that feels too wide after months of confinement. They walked slowly, under the watchful but relaxed eyes of American sentries. The harbor stretched before them. Wrecked barges, twisted metal, half-sunk ships, the remains of a war that had devoured millions. Yet among the ruins, gulls circled, and fishermen repaired their nets as though life itself refused to surrender. Renee pointed toward the sea. Before the war, he said softly, this port sent ships to every corner of the world. Coffee, tobacco, silk, everything passed through here. It was a place for connection. Maybe it will be again. Liesel watched the horizon. The wind burned her face, but she did not flinch. Do you think we will go home soon? She asked. Renee hesitated. Some will. Some may stay in camps a while longer. There is much to repair. The world is slow at forgiving. She nodded. The word forgiving struck her like a wave. She realized she had never considered forgiveness as something she could give, only something she might beg for. When they returned inside, the medics were cleaning their instruments, preparing to move to another assignment. Lewis, the sergeant, knelt by a crate of supplies, checking labels. He looked up when the women entered. Out for a walk? He asked with a smile. Renee translated, and the women nodded. Lewis chuckled. Good. You need air, not just walls. As he stood, Liesel noticed a small scar running along his jawline, a souvenir from the war. For a moment, she wondered what pain hid behind that easy smile. She wanted to ask, but her English was broken. Instead, she said softly, Danke. He paused, then replied, Bitte. The word sounded foreign on his tongue, but he said it carefully, with respect. Something inside her shifted. She realized that this exchange, a German prisoner thanking an American soldier, was the quietest kind of revolution. That evening, as the light faded, the women were allowed to help prepare supper. They moved awkwardly among the Americans, unsure of their place, but the work gave them purpose. They peeled potatoes, washed metal trays, stirred the thin soup. Laughter began to rise, hesitant at first, then genuine. When a pot slipped from one woman's hand and clanged to the floor, everyone froze. But instead of anger, Lewis only laughed and said, It happens. Renee translated, and soon even the prisoners were smiling. For the first time since the surrender, laughter did not feel like betrayal. After supper, the medics gathered near the stove, sharing cigarettes. The women sat along the wall, listening to the rhythmic crackle of burning wood. The smell of smoke, mixed with wool and salt, wrapped the room in something that felt almost like home. Renee spoke softly to Liesel. When the Americans leave, I think this place will be empty again. She looked around the room, at the women quietly talking, at the guards leaning against the doorframe, at the blanket still heavy on her shoulders. No, she said. Something will stay. Maybe not the soldiers, but what they did. Renee nodded slowly. Yes, the small things always remain the longest. Outside, snow began to fall again. Slow, deliberate flakes that softened even the ruins. It landed on barbed wire, on helmets, on the broken windows of the warehouse. The world seemed, for the first time in years, willing to be gentle. Liesel closed her eyes and listened. The snow made no sound, but she could feel it. The earth's quiet attempt to heal. That night, she dreamed of her home in Hamburg, of her father's hands covered in coal dust, of the smell of bread from the bakery below their apartment, of her younger brother waving from the doorway. But the dream did not end in fire, as it always had. Instead, the same blanket from the camp covered them all, its weight both foreign and familiar. When she woke, her cheeks were wet with tears. Across the room, Erica was already awake, staring into the dim light. "What will happen to us now?" she whispered. Liesel pulled the blanket tighter. "Maybe we learn how to live again." Outside, the first trucks were starting their engines, their sound echoing over the harbor. Somewhere beyond the mist, ships waited to carry soldiers home. Inside the warehouse, the women began to rise, folding their blankets, washing their faces, straightening their hair. They did not look like prisoners anymore. Not entirely. Something invisible had changed. They stood straighter, breathed deeper, and looked one another in the eyes. In a world still broken by hatred, the smallest act of humanity had begun to rebuild something larger than walls, something called trust. And as the sea wind swept through the open door, carrying with it the smell of salt and smoke, the women of Le Havre realized that the war had taken their homes, their names, even their country. But it had not taken their capacity to feel the warmth of another's kindness. The next morning came with the sound of gulls circling above the port. Their cries were sharp, cutting through the mist that clung to the water like an old memory refusing to fade. The Americans were packing supplies, preparing for transport. The women, now allowed to move in small groups, helped without being ordered. It was not obedience anymore. It was the slow rhythm of gratitude taking shape through action. Liesel stood near the door, watching Louis check the cargo lists. His voice was calm, efficient, but every few minutes he looked toward the sea, that endless horizon that seemed to pull at every soldier's heart. She had seen that look before, years earlier, on her brother's face before he left for the Eastern Front. The same mixture of duty and emptiness. The difference was that her brother had gone to spread destruction. This man was trying to rebuild. When Louis noticed her gaze, he gave a brief nod, not a smile, not command, but a recognition. Two survivors acknowledging each other across the distance of language. René, ever the bridge between their worlds, approached with his notebook. "Orders," he said. "Tomorrow, a few of you will be moved inland. A proper camp, better housing. The rest will wait here." Liesel felt her stomach tighten. And the Americans? They go on to another front. Prisoners still in need, hospitals still waiting. There's no end yet for those who heal. She looked down at her hands. They were cleaner now, the skin no longer cracked. But beneath the surface, a question had begun to burn. What happens when the people who saved you leave? That evening, Louis asked René to translate something for the women. "Tell them," he said, "they'll be safe. No one will hurt them here. The war's over. They should try to rest." René hesitated, then repeated it in German. The words fell into the air like a prayer too fragile to believe. "Der Krieg ist vorbei. Ihr seid in Sicherheit." Some women began to weep silently. Others stared at the floor, lips trembling. The idea of safety, real safety, felt impossible. Liesel wanted to thank him, but could not find the words. She only managed, "We didn't think we'd live this way." Louis looked at her for a long time before answering softly, "Neither did we." There was no victory in his tone, only weariness. The war had taken too much from both sides to leave anyone untouched. Later that night, after the lights dimmed, A storm rolled in from the channel. The wind slammed against the roof, and rain began to leak through the holes in the corrugated tin. The women scrambled to move their bedding away from the dripping spots. Liesel rushed to help Erica drag a crate across the floor. When the thunder came, several women screamed, not from surprise, but from the echo it carried. To them, thunder still meant bombs. Lewis and the other medics returned, bringing extra blankets and lanterns. They moved through the chaos with quiet urgency. "It's all right," Renee called out. "No bombs, just rain." But the sound of the storm was merciless, a roar that swallowed reason. Liesel crouched by the wall, trembling. Her breath came short, her mind flashing with the memory of firestorms in Hamburg. The air so hot it burned to breathe, the sky red with falling embers. Then a hand rested on her shoulder. "Lewis." His palm was warm, firm. He didn't speak. He simply stayed there, the weight of his presence grounding her in the present moment. The sound of rain, not bombs. The smell of wet wool, not burning flesh. Slowly, her breathing steadied. She looked up, and for the first time, she saw not an American soldier, but a man. Tired, human, as lost in the wreckage of this world as she was. The storm lasted hours. When it finally broke, dawn crept in pale and wet. Puddles mirrored the soft orange light of the stoves. The medics, drenched and shivering, still worked through the night. They had covered the sleeping women with extra blankets, patching leaks with tarps and canvas. Liesel rose, her hair damp, her body heavy but alive. She stepped outside and found Lewis standing by the water, smoking. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. He turned, exhaling smoke through the gray air. "No one sleeps much anymore." Renee translated for her, then added softly, "He says it's the same for all of us." They stood in silence. The sea lapped gently against the docks, washing away the night's debris. Bits of paper, scraps of rope, a single boot left from a forgotten soldier. Liesel whispered, half to herself, "The fire has ended. Now comes the water." Renee translated, and Lewis looked out toward the horizon. "Yeah," he murmured, "but water can heal what fire destroys." The wind carried the words across the harbor. And for a moment, the three of them stood in quiet agreement. Three people from three nations that had torn the world apart. Now watching it begin, however slowly, to mend itself. That afternoon, the women were given soap and basins again. This time, no one hesitated. They washed their faces, their hair, their arms. The water was warm, the scent of soap faint but sweet. Laughter returned, hesitant, childlike, like music forgotten. One woman began humming a hymn, soft and trembling. Another joined her. Soon the warehouse filled with a low, wordless harmony that rose through the cracks in the roof and out into the gray sky. Lewis paused in his work to listen. "Sounds like church," he said. Renee smiled. "Maybe it is." For those few moments, the camp was a cathedral without walls. That night, when darkness fell again, Liesel sat by the window, watching the flickering lights on the water. She thought of her family, of her brother lost in the east, of her father who would never return. She thought of the men who had brought blankets instead of rifles. And she whispered a small prayer. Not to God, not to Germany, but to the simple mercy that had saved her soul. Outside, the storm's last drops fell into the sea, fire giving way to water, hate to compassion, destruction to the fragile beginnings of peace. And in that sound, the soft rhythm of rain dissolving into tide, the war, for the first time, began to feel like something that could truly end. The following day began not with thunder or wind, but with the quiet rhythm of footsteps and the faint clinking of tin cups. The camp at Le Havre had settled into something resembling order. Not the order of command, but of fragile trust. The war had ended, yet its ghosts still walked among them, invisible but heavy. The women moved slower now, no longer out of exhaustion, but from uncertainty, that strange paralysis of realizing they were alive when they had not expected to be. They lined up for breakfast as they had for punishment months before. But the eyes that watched them now were gentler, and the hands that handed them food were no longer the hands of enemies. Louis stood at the counter, serving ladles of hot oatmeal. His sleeves were rolled up, the skin beneath pale and scarred. Beside him, Renee translated short exchanges. More sugar? Careful, hot. No hurry. Simple words. Yet, in their simplicity, something sacred began to form. A new language, built not of grammar or ideology, but of gestures and tone. Liesel took her bowl and murmured, "Danke." Louis nodded, smiling slightly. "Bitte," he said again, clumsy but sincere. The sound made her laugh softly, the first real laugh in months. It startled her as much as anyone else. Renee, overhearing, smiled. That word, it is medicine. After breakfast, the medics prepared to move out. The next group of prisoners would arrive soon, and orders required rotation. The women were told that a new unit would replace them. French officers, then perhaps Red Cross personnel. When the announcement was translated, the warehouse grew still. For all their talk of freedom, the women realized how deeply they had come to rely on these quiet American soldiers. Their patience, their silence, their strange, unspoken mercy. Erica whispered. "They'll leave, and the world will turn cold again." "No," said Liesel, "not if we remember." The morning passed in work. The women helped carry crates, scrub the floors, fold the wool blankets that had once saved them from the cold. It was a kind of ritual, returning what had been given, as if to prove they were worthy of it. Louis, supervising the loading of medical supplies, caught sight of Liesel struggling with a box nearly her size. "Too heavy," he said. Renee translated. Liesel shook her head, defiant. "I can do it." Louis stepped forward, lifted the box effortlessly, and placed it on the truck. "There," he said. "Together is easier." The phrase lingered in her mind long after he walked away. Together is easier. She had spent years being told the opposite. That strength came from separation, from purity, from the iron division between us and them. Yet here, in a ruined port, the hands that once built walls were now dismantling them, plank by plank, with quiet cooperation. That afternoon, as the sky cleared, the medics gathered for a final inspection. Their truck engines rumbled to life, a sound both ordinary and heartbreaking. The women stood outside, uncertain whether they were allowed to watch. Louis noticed and waved them closer. "Goodbye," he said simply. Renee repeated the word in German, "Auf Wiedersehen." The women murmured it back, some awkwardly, others through tears. One of the medics handed Liesel a small object, a piece of folded cloth, tied with string. Inside was a scrap of paper with 2 words written carefully in pencil. "Stay warm." She didn't know what to say. Words, in any language, felt too small. So she did the only thing she could. She reached out her hand. Louis hesitated, then took it, gently, like holding something fragile. The handshake was brief, but in that moment, the entire weight of the war seemed to pass between them and dissolve. It was not forgiveness spoken, it was forgiveness felt. When the trucks finally drove away, the sound of engines faded into the wind, leaving behind an ache that was neither loss nor comfort, but both. The women watched until the dust settled. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Erica said, "Do you think they'll remember us?" Liesel turned toward the sea, her blanket draped loosely over her shoulders. "They will," she said softly, "because they chose to be human when they didn't have to be." Renee, standing nearby, nodded. And that is how history begins again. In the days that followed, the camp changed hands. French officers replaced the Americans. They were not cruel, but distant, efficient, weary. The warmth that had filled the warehouse began to cool, like embers fading after a storm. Yet the memory of it, the tone of voices, the quiet laughter, the hands offering cups and blankets, lingered like an invisible fire. Each evening, Liesel found herself looking toward the road where the trucks had vanished. Sometimes she imagined hearing the faint echo of a harmonica or the clink of metal cups, and she smiled. The war had broken her language, her faith, and her nation. But in that place, she had learned another kind of speech, the language of hands. A blanket offered, a spoon shared, a hand outstretched in silence. That language required no victory. It required only courage. The courage to be kind after hatred, to touch what had been declared untouchable. Weeks later, when the women were finally transported to another holding center, the blankets went with them. Most were worn, stained, heavy with salt. But none were discarded. Each woman carried hers as though it were part of her own story. On the truck ride inland, Liesel held hers close and whispered a few English words she had memorized. "Stay warm." Erica turned to her. "What does that mean?" Liesel smiled faintly. "It means, don't let the cold win again." Outside, the French countryside passed in silence. Fields blackened by winter, trees stripped bare. Yet beneath the frost, new grass was waiting, unseen but certain. And as the trucks moved through the ruins of a continent learning to breathe again, Liesel closed her eyes and imagined those American medics somewhere far away. Perhaps already home, perhaps still healing others. And she prayed that they, too, were warm. Because the greatest truth she had learned in that gray, broken camp was this: sometimes salvation comes not through words, but through hands. Steady, rough, trembling, that choose mercy over vengeance. And long after the uniforms are gone, the touch remains. The road inland was long, silent, and gray. A winding ribbon that cut through the scarred landscape of post-war France. Burned-out vehicles rusted on the shoulder. Fields lay fallow, dotted with craters and the broken bones of once proud trees. Every village they passed was half ruin, half memory. Yet in the back of the military truck, the German women held tightly to the only thing that still gave warmth: the American wool blankets folded in their arms. They did not speak much. Words felt brittle. But their silence was different now. Not the silence of fear, but of reverence. For what they had seen, for what they had survived, and for what had been given to them without being asked. Liesel stared at the distant horizon, her fingers curled tightly into the blanket. Its coarse fabric scratched at her skin, but she clung to it all the same. It was no longer just cloth. It was proof. Proof that the enemy had not become what Germany had always warned her he would be. At the transit stop, French officers sorted the women quickly. Names checked, documents recorded, destinations assigned. The new camp was inland, smaller, surrounded by farmland and silence. The barracks were wooden, weather-beaten, but dry. Yet something had shifted in the women. They no longer waited for cruelty. They no longer walked hunched under the weight of dread. And the first thing they did, without being asked, was sweep the floor. In that new place, time slowed. The days passed, not with fear, but with memory. The women began to speak of the American medics, not by name, for few had been known, but by gestures, by moments. The one who gave me a spoon. The one who held my hand when the storm came. The one who wrapped the blanket around my shoulders like I was someone worth saving. They began to tell the stories again and again, as if speaking them aloud might keep the warmth alive. One night, Erica asked, "Will we ever tell our families?" Liesl hesitated. Would they believe it? The question lingered like smoke. When spring came, it arrived slowly, with mud and thaw. The snow receded, and thin green shoots pushed up through the cracks in the courtyard. The women planted small seeds behind the barracks, peas, carrots, wild herbs. The earth, too, had not forgotten how to offer kindness. One morning, a French guard came with a list. 5 names, he said. Transport to the Red Cross, repatriation possible. Liesl's name was on the list. So was Erica's. That night, they did not sleep. They lay on their bunks in silence, fingers clutching their blankets like rosaries. "What will we say when we go back?" Erica whispered. Liesl turned toward her, eyes open in the dark. "We tell the truth." "What truth?" "That they gave us warmth." The journey to the Red Cross station was quiet. The women said little, each folded inward, replaying memories like films flickering across their minds. At the station, a young British nurse checked them in. Her hands were clean, quick, professional. She asked no questions beyond name and health. When she saw the blankets, she paused. "American issue," she said. "You kept them?" Liesl met her gaze. "They kept us." The nurse said nothing more, only nodded. The kind of nod that meant she had seen too much to need an explanation. A few days later, in a quiet room with a single window, Liesl was handed civilian clothes. A blouse, a skirt, new shoes. A Red Cross clerk handed her a small mirror. She held it carefully, almost afraid to look. When she did, she gasped. The face staring back was still hers, but older, thinner, and somehow softer. The hollow cheeks were filling again, the eyes no longer clouded by smoke. She ran her hand through her hair, now clean and brushed. It was not beauty she saw. It was something more sacred. The return of self. She folded the clothes neatly and looked down at her blanket. She hesitated, then placed it gently into her satchel. She would not leave it behind. The journey to the German border was long. The train passed through towns where buildings leaned like exhausted men, their windows staring out at the world they no longer recognized. At each stop, Liesl looked out, searching for signs of what remained. A child laughing, a man mending a fence, a woman hanging sheets in spring air. Life. It was still there, small, quiet, unannounced. At the border station, a Red Cross officer checked her papers. "Final destination, Hamburg," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. The man looked at her kindly. "We've had many from there. It's not what it was." She nodded. "Neither am I." As she crossed into Germany, Liesl felt the past pressing in. Not just the war, but the years before it. The posters, the teachers, the songs, the parades. The dream that became a machine. The machine that became a furnace. And yet, amid all that weight, she carried something else. A blanket, a spoon, a memory of hands that did not strike, but served. That night, when she reached what remained of her neighborhood, she found only ashes and stone. Her childhood home was gone. The bakery was rubble. The air smelled of dust and oil. But a neighbor, old Frau Metzger, whom Liesl had assumed dead, opened her door when she knocked. "Mein Gott," the woman whispered. "You're alive." Liesl nodded. Barely. She was given a cot in the attic, a warm bowl of soup, and silence. And as she lay beneath her American blanket in the half-light of a ruined city, She whispered aloud. For no one but herself. They did not hurt us. They wrapped us in blankets. They chose to be human. And I will remember. The attic room was small, its beams warped with time and weather, the floor uneven beneath a thin mattress. Wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, curling around Liesel's ankles as she lay wrapped in the American blanket. Yet for the first time since returning to Germany, she felt safe. It wasn't the safety of home. Her home was gone, crushed by fire and artillery. Nor was it the safety of old certainty. That too had been buried beneath the rubble of Berlin and the silence of surrendered streets. It was something more fragile, the safety of memory. She closed her eyes and held the edge of the blanket to her face. It still carried the faintest smell of smoke, salt, and something else. Perhaps the metal tang of wartime wool. Perhaps the ghost of a soldier's hands. And in that moment, she began to understand. The warmth they had given her had not stayed in Le Havre. She had brought it with her. The days passed slowly in Hamburg. The city no longer echoed with boots and anthems. Instead, it creaked and limped under the weight of rebuilding. Roofs patched with scrap wood, windows covered in canvas, meals boiled over makeshift fires. Frau Metzger, the old widow who had taken her in, moved quietly through her routines. She rarely asked questions. It was the German way now, to survive first, to speak later. But one evening, over a bowl of barley stew, she looked across the small table and said, "You were a prisoner." Liesel nodded. "Did they beat you?" Liesel stared into her spoon, watching the broth ripple. "No," she whispered. The old woman said nothing for a long while. Then, "That's not what we were told." Liesel raised her eyes. "That's not what we were told either." Their gazes met across the table. Two Germans, two women, two survivors. And between them, silence. But not the kind that hides. The kind that waits. One morning, Liesel found herself walking past the ruins of her school. The building had been reduced to a skeletal frame, iron twisted, desks charred. She stepped over the threshold of the main hall, her boots crunching on shattered glass and bits of plaster. She could still see it in her mind. The banners on the walls, the way they'd been taught to sing. The speeches about destiny and blood. The way they had all stood when the Reich's anthem played. She stood now in that same place, and it was empty. She took the blanket from her bag and held it in her arms. Not as a shield, not as a symbol, but as proof that even here in the ruins of indoctrination, something kind had survived. That night, she began to write. At first, just fragments. Sentences she repeated silently in her mind for weeks. They gave us soap. They gave us tea. They did not ask us to confess anything. They treated us as if we still had worth. Then more, I do not know the names of the men who helped us. But I remember their hands, how they trembled when they bandaged frostbitten feet. I remember the way they sat near the stove and passed their cigarettes without words. Each sentence she wrote down with care, as though building a monument not of stone, but of memory. She had no illusions that anyone wanted to read it. Germany was too busy burying its shame beneath bricks and silence. But she had to write it, because if she didn't, the story would vanish. The one story that had nothing to do with battles or politics, and everything to do with choosing compassion when no one demanded it. Weeks turned into months. The snow thawed. New markets opened. Church bells rang again, though more softly than before. And one day, a man in a Red Cross uniform came to the neighborhood, distributing forms for survivors to record their experiences. Liesel took the form and tucked it into her bag. That night, she sat beneath the attic window, candle flickering, and copied her notes onto the page. When asked for Nature of Captivity, she wrote, "Held in American transit camp, Le Havre, France." Winter 1945. When asked for conditions endured, she paused. Then with steady hand, she wrote, "Given food, given water, given dignity." Years passed. The war faded into textbooks and commemorations. New walls were built, not of concrete, but of narratives. In East Germany, former prisoners were silent. In the West, shame whispered in every household. But Liesel never let go of the blanket. She kept it in a chest beneath her bed, folded neatly, its edges fraying with time. And once a year, on the anniversary of the day she had first received it, she would take it out, sit in silence, and remember. Not just the moment the blanket was placed on her shoulders, but the way the American medic had looked at her. The way he had not looked through her, but at her as a human being, not a defeated enemy. It was that moment, more than any document, treaty, or trial, that marked the end of the war for her. Because in that moment, hatred had been refused, and that refusal had saved her. One spring, long after her hair had turned to silver and the streets of Hamburg had filled with new, laughing children, Liesel received a letter. It came from Ohio. Inside was a short note. "Found your name in the Red Cross archive. I was one of the medics. I never forgot that winter." There was no return address, only a name. She held the paper to her chest and wept. Not from grief, but from the overwhelming, quiet knowledge that memory, real memory, had survived on both sides of the sea. And in that attic, under a blanket that had once been offered by an enemy, Liesel whispered again the only words she had carried with her across borders, across years, across silence. "Stay warm." The letter stayed with her, tucked between the pages of the small journal where she had written everything. Not just the days in Le Havre, but the moments that defied explanation. The storm, the hot water, the music that sounded like forgiveness. And now, after all those years, a name, a thread across oceans and time. Liesel read it again under the soft yellow light of her lamp, her hands trembling not from age, but from the sudden weight of memory pressing close. I never forgot that winter. It didn't say much. It didn't need to, because neither had she. It had been nearly 3 decades since she returned to Germany, and the world had changed more than anyone could have imagined. The scars of war were no longer visible on the walls. They lived in silence now, passed between generations like inherited pain. Young people walked past the ruins without slowing, unaware that their feet traced the same paths where hunger once ruled and shame hung like smoke. Liesel had lived a quiet life, never married, never left Hamburg again. She became a school teacher. She baked her own bread. She tended a small garden, but she never forgot. Each year, on the first day of winter, she would gather her students, and instead of teaching dates and maps, she would tell them the story of the blanket. They were always surprised. They expected tales of horror, of cruelty, of cold steel and punishment. And yes, she told them those too, of bombings and silence and trains that never returned. But then she would show them the blanket, folded with care, and speak of the night an American soldier knelt beside her and placed it on her shoulders without saying a word. "You see," she would say gently, "kindness is not weakness. Kindness is strength that chooses not to strike." And always, in the front row, there would be one child, usually a boy with sharp eyes and clenched fists, who would look down at the floor. She knew that child. She had been that child once, raised on slogans and separation, and she prayed every year that something in her story would soften the walls he'd been taught to build. One day, a girl named Miriam stayed after class. She was quiet, delicate, her father a veteran of a war she would never understand. "Frau Liesel," she asked, "why didn't they hurt you?" The question was so direct, so childlike, that it stunned her. Liesel placed the chalk on her desk and sat beside her. Because they had already seen too much hurt. And maybe they wanted something in the world to stop hurting. Miriam frowned. But they were the enemy. Liesel nodded. Yes, and so was I. The girl's eyes widened. But you're good? No, she whispered. I became good because someone chose not to treat me like I was evil. Miriam didn't speak after that. She only reached forward, gently touched the edge of the blanket, and left the room in silence. Time moved like water. Seasons changed. Liesel grew older, slower, more bent. But the ritual never left her. Every winter she unfolded the blanket again, laid it over her lap, poured tea into the same tin cup she had kept from the camp, and sat by the window as the frost curled on the glass. She would close her eyes and listen for the wind off the sea. She could still hear the creak of the warehouse door, the whistle of the kettle, the soft scuff of boots walking across wet concrete. The voices had faded, but the feeling had not. She didn't know what happened to Louis, the sergeant who had handed her a spoon, who had offered care without conditions. But somewhere in Ohio, perhaps another window held the reflection of an old man who once wrapped blankets around the women of the enemy. Perhaps, like her, he still remembered. Not the names, not even the dates, but the feeling. The moment he chose to do something kind in a world made entirely of cruelty. As the Cold War divided continents and new conflicts lit across the globe, Liesel kept her peace not through protest, but through remembrance. She told no lies about the past. She did not excuse what had been done in her name. But she always ended her story the same way. History is not only what men build with tanks and orders. It is what they choose to do when no one is watching. That night, in Le Havre, a man chose to give me warmth instead of wrath. And so I lived. And because I lived, I remember, one winter, when she was already too weak to rise without help, a group of her former students came to visit. They were grown now, with children of their own. They sat around her fireplace, listening as she told the story again. She held the blanket in her lap, worn thin but still warm. When she finished, one of them, a young woman named Sophia, asked softly, "What would you tell the world now, if you could?" Liesel looked out the window, where snow had begun to fall. It was soft and quiet, like the night they arrived at the camp. She spoke without turning. Cover one another. When the world burns, cover someone else with your blanket, even if they are the enemy, especially then. Sophia nodded, tears in her eyes. Liesel smiled faintly. Because that is the only warmth we ever get to keep. That night, after they left, she folded the blanket one last time. Her hands were stiff, her breath shallow, but she did it slowly, as if finishing a prayer, and she whispered into the silence of her small home, "Stay warm." Liesel passed away quietly in the final days of winter, in the same small attic room where she had returned from the war decades before. The snow was falling that morning, slow and soundless, drifting over the windowsill, like the breath of something sacred. She was found seated in her armchair, hands folded over her lap, the American Army blanket tucked gently around her legs. On the table beside her was a cold cup of tea and a single slip of paper. Written in neat, careful German were 3 words: "Ich erinnere mich." I remember. At her funeral, only a handful of people came. A few old students, some neighbors, a distant cousin from Stuttgart. The pastor spoke of her quiet life, her years as a school teacher, her kindness. But the words that lingered were not spoken from the pulpit. They came later in the gathering outside the chapel, when Sophia, the young woman who had visited her that last winter, opened a small satchel she had carried with her. Inside, folded with reverence, was the blanket. Gasps rose from the older mourners. A few of them remembered the story. The American soldiers, the transit camp, the silent kindness. But seeing the blanket again made it real, tangible, human. She kept it all her life, Sophia said. She told us it saved her. Someone asked quietly, saved her from what? Sophia smiled sadly. From forgetting that we are more than what we were told to be. Later that year, Sophia organized an exhibit at a small museum in Hamburg, The Humanity That Survived. In the center of the display was the blanket. Next to it, a journal. Beside that, a faded photograph of Liesel in her later years, sitting by a window, the blanket over her knees. A simple plaque read, Winter 1945, Le Havre. A German prisoner of war expected punishment. Instead, an American soldier gave her warmth. She never forgot. Visitors came, school children, veterans, tourists. Some passed by quickly, others lingered. A woman from America, in her 60s, stood for a long time in front of the blanket. Her father had served in the war, but never spoke of it. He had died with secrets. She had come to Europe hoping for fragments. When she read Liesel's story, she wept quietly. Not because it named her father, it didn't, but because it named something she had always hoped he had been. Decent. She left a note in the guest book. If you were one of them, Dad. Thank you. In a classroom 2 blocks from the museum, a teacher read the story to a new generation. She held up a copy of Liesel's journal, now published in small editions across Germany. She asked the children, what is stronger, an army or a blanket? Most of them laughed at first. Then they grew quiet. One girl in the back raised her hand and said, the blanket, because it didn't have to be given. The teacher nodded. That's right. It was a choice. In Ohio, in a quiet veteran's home, an old man sat by a window in a wheelchair. His hands were spotted, veins raised, the strength long gone from his grip. One day, a nurse brought him a package, forwarded through a museum, a university, and a family whose name he didn't recognize. Inside was a photograph, a folded copy of the story, and a single line written beneath it. You were remembered. The old man didn't speak. He only held the photo in his hands. His eyes filled with water, not from pain, but from something deeper. The realization that a moment of silent mercy, given in a war he had tried to forget, had lived far beyond him. He placed the photograph on the windowsill, where the morning light could find it, and he whispered to himself, I remember too. Years passed. Wars continued. Lines were redrawn. Flags changed. But some stories, quiet, stubborn stories, refused to fade. Stories not about generals or speeches, not about victory or surrender, but about a moment in a ruined warehouse where one human being chose not to hate another. Liesel's blanket now rests in a glass case, its threads preserved, but still rough with time. School children press their hands to the glass, staring at something that once warmed a prisoner, not because it is beautiful, not because it is grand, but because it is true, a truth that does not ask for permission, a truth that survives history, a truth that says, in the coldest winters, what we give, not what we take, is what remains. Outside the museum, a small plaque sits beneath a tree planted in her honor. The inscription reads, Liesel, 1922-1998. She returned with nothing, but carried home a warmth that still lives. And every year, on the first day of winter, someone, no one knows who, places a folded wool blanket at the foot of the tree. No note, no flowers, no name, just warmth. Because some stories end not in silence, but in echoes.